Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 544, and today is February 14th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about in today's show, so don't miss the episode and be sure to share it if you can. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and we repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. The video version of the show is up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee, and it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. And by the way, if you're following me on Twitter, they now have this kind of notification bell similar to YouTube. So if you go to my profile, KyleAnzalone_, and you hit that notification, it'll give you an actual reminder of when I send out my tweets. A lot of times, even though I have thousands of followers, only a couple dozen or 100 people will see a tweet that I put out just because X isn't putting it up in everybody's algorithm. So if you go ahead and you notify yourself that I'm putting out tweets, then you're probably going to see a far higher number of them. So think about using that feature. And with that, let's get into today's show. First up here, this is from the Baltimore Sun. House committee advances bill that reduces transparency over weapon sales. So the Sun writes, after U.S. arms exports hit a record high in 2023, the House Foreign Affairs Committee voted to advance legislation on December 6th aimed at speeding up arms exports. Critics are concerned that transparency will be the victim of the legislation, which amends the Arms Export Control Act to increase the threshold for reporting to Congress arms sales to other countries. Representative Michael Waltz, he's a Republican from Florida, introduced the legislation in December. It's co-sponsored by two Democrats, Representative Seth Mullen of Massachusetts and Jared Merkowitz of Florida. Merkowitz was the only Democrat in the Foreign Affairs panel to vote in favor of the bill, which passed 26-20. We should learn from Ukraine and simplify this bureaucracy so that they can do the fighting for their interests with less involvement from the United States, Waltz said during the hearing. But Kathy Manning, a Democrat from North Carolina, objected to the measure during a Foreign Affairs Committee hearing last week. She said, the real impact of the bill is to diminish our constitutional oversight duty and our responsibility as legislators with the prospect of less oversight. This is not simply an inflation fix. Current regulations require Congress to be informed of arms exports at least $200 million in military design and construction services, $50 million in defense technology, and $14 million in major defense equipment, or $1 million in certain other categories of weapons. Thresholds are higher for NATO members as well as Australia, Israel, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. I think there's a couple more countries on that list. They're non-NATO major U.S. allies. So I think that also now includes Colombia, Taiwan, and Qatar at least, and maybe the UAE. For these transactions, the president must notify Congress 15 days in advance of the transfer, whereas most other contracts require a 30-day review period. And just for a little additional background here, the review period is what allows Congress to potentially block a weapons sale. See, the way it should work is that the president should propose a weapons sale and then it needs the explicit approval of Congress. But what happens is the president approves a weapons sale, or the State Department approves a weapons sale and notifies Congress that they have done so, which kicks off the counter on a period, either 30 or 15-day period, where Congress can vote and pass a bill that actually blocks a weapons sale, although this never gets done. So the legislation increases the dollar thresholds by at least 60%. The bill also allows the Secretary of State to complete arms sales or transfers that have been delayed by Congress for 3 years. And so this, again, is looking at eroding any transparency that Congress has on the issue. We also have the Senate passing the massive $95 billion war funding bill. This got passed, I believe, on Thursday morning, pretty early in the morning, too. It includes 61 billion for Ukraine, 14 billion for Israel, and billions for the military buildup against China. This bill does not have the 20 plus billion for border security. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. My initial thoughts were there's no way this legislation gets passed without the border stuff in it. However, I'm not 100% sure of that anymore. And there's a lot of pressure on the House to take up this bill. And I think if the House actually takes up this bill and allows it to go to the floor for a vote, there's a good chance that it is going to pass. I don't think, my guess is almost every Democrat votes for it. Maybe a few of the squad members do not because of the aid to Israel. But I can't imagine it's more than 4 or 5. And I would guess there's going to be dozens of Republicans that vote for this legislation. And only Massey, Andy Bids said on the Napolitano show, Judge Napolitano show, that he wouldn't vote for it. So there's a couple of Republicans that won't vote for it, maybe the House Freedom Caucus, but I don't think it's going to be enough to set off the Democratic no votes. So want to talk about that bill a little bit because of a statement that Senator Chris Van Hollen made on the Israeli floor. So Dave wrote this up for the antiwar.com. Senator Van Hollen calls Israelis war criminals and then votes to send $14 billion in new military aid. So in an impassioned speech on the Senate floor on Monday, Senator Chris Van Hollen, he's a Democrat from Maryland, called the Israelis war criminals for intentionally withholding food from Gazan children that are starving. But Tuesday morning, Holland voted yes on a $95 billion foreign military aid bill that includes $14 billion to support Israel's slaughter of Palestinians. Van Holland said, "Kids in Gaza are now dying from deliberate withholding of food. In addition to the horror of that news, one other thing is true, that it is a war crime. It is a textbook war crime. That makes those who orchestrated war criminals." The senator said President Biden must demand that Netanyahu immediately allow more food and water and other life-saving supplies into Gaza and make sure it reaches the children and other people starving. If Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't agree to the demands, Van Hollen said President Biden should invoke Section 620-1 of the Foreign Assistance Act, which designates to cut off arms exports to countries that's restricting to the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Van Hollen also attempted to justify his reason for voting to send $14 billion in military aid to people he described as war criminals. According to The Intercept, he cited the $60 billion in spending on the proxy war for Ukraine and the $19.2 billion in humanitarian assistance for Ukraine, Gaza, and other war zones around the world as enough of a reason to pass the bill that will give more weapons to a government that recently killed 12,300 Palestinian children. And so I want to add on to that as well. And this is one of the worst things about the bills, and maybe one of the worst things the Democrats have ever done, starting with the party head Joe Biden. And that is pretending that this legislation does anything to help the Palestinians when in reality it absolutely strangles them. It prevents any funds from going to UNRWA, the UN aid agency for Palestine, which is the group that's right now responsible and is actually conducting all the aid transfers into Gaza. And so it's not as simple as just saying that, oh, we're not going to give the money to UNRWA, we're going to give the money to other aid organizations. It doesn't work that way. And if you try to do that, it's going to cause a massive problem in aid distribution in Gaza, and it's going to lead to the suffering of a lot more people. So, passing this bill, of course, is going to kill more Palestinians, even if the aid money did go to UNRWA, just because you're giving Israel $14 billion more dollars in weapons to kill Palestinians with. But it's even worse than that because the aid is just a sham. It's just a cover to allow Israel to keep killing and the Biden administration to pretend like they're not just supporting it. All right. Couple stories here on the war in Ukraine before we really get into the news coming from Israel. This one I wrote at the Libertarian Institute. Anti-conscription protests emerge in Ukraine. This on February 12th. Women of a village took to the streets to block any potential Ukrainian military officials from entering their town and taking more men off to war. The protest broke out as the Ukrainian government searches for solutions to its dire troop shortage. Tuesday's rally took place in a region of Ukraine that has been generally supportive regarding the war effort. After rumors emerged that recruitment officials were coming to the village of Komach, several women set up a roadblock. About 100 women attended the protest. The rally occurred as Kiev is struggling to find enough men to hold off the advancing Russian forces. President Zelensky has resisted a plan that would lower the draft age from 27 to 25 to add 500,000 new troops to the Ukrainian military. Zelensky's refusal to expand the conscription law added to the rift between the president and General Volushny. Volushny was the commander of Ukrainian forces until he was ousted by Zelensky last week. The Washington Post reports that Ukrainian forces are facing a massive troop shortage. The Ukrainian military is facing a critical shortage of infantry, leading to the exhaustion and diminished morale on the front lines. In interviews across the front lines, nearly a dozen soldiers and commanders said that personnel deficits were the most critical problem now, as Russia has regained the offensive initiative on the battlefield and is stepping up its attacks, the Post reported. The manpower deficit has Zelensky in a difficult situation. The president has vowed to retake all of Ukrainian territory, yet he doesn't have a large enough army to prevent the current Russian advance. At the same time, Ukrainians become war averse, and expanding the draft is politically unpopular. All right, another one I wrote for the Institute. Norway warns that Russia is stronger in a stronger position now than a year ago. So a top Norwegian official warned that Ukraine was facing multiple challenges and Russia was getting stronger. The bleak assessment was made as US and Europe look to commit over $100 billion to the Ukrainian war effort. On the battlefield, Kiev is facing a shortage of soldiers and arms. The head of Norway's military intelligence unit, Nils Stennesens, said in this war, Russia is currently in a stronger position than it was a year ago, and in the process of gaining the advantage. He added that Russia can mobilize around 3 times more troops than Ukraine. Nearly 2 years ago, Washington and its NATO partners agreed to back Ukraine in a proxy war to weaken Russia. However, it is Ukraine that is now on the brink of defeat. Kiev has depleted its weapon stockpiles, including 155mm artillery rounds and air defense interceptors. Future arms deliveries to Ukraine are in question as a $61 billion funding package for Kiev remains stalled in Congress. Even if the House passed the bill funding the war in Ukraine, Kiev faces other challenges. In addition to the $61 billion the White House is pushing Congress to allocate to the war in Ukraine, the European Union recently agreed to a $50 billion economic aid package for Kiev. Still, the Norwegian official warned Ukraine will need a significant influx of aid to regain the upper hand on the battlefield. He said extensive Western weapons aid would be needed for the Ukrainian forces to be able to defend themselves and to regain the initiative in the conflict. Weapon production delays continue in the West. Currently, orders placed for 155mm shells take 1 to 2 years to be delivered. Adding to Kiev's problems is a severe troop shortage. Zelensky appears to be unable to address the manpower shortage as Ukrainians are beginning to protest future conscription programs. The Norwegian official explained that Russia does not face the same challenges, even in the face of a Western economic war. He said Moscow is tackling sanctions better than expected. Moscow's industry can now produce enough munitions, combat vehicles, drones, missiles to enable its troops to maintain the war effort all year. Denmark's defense minister made a similar remark last week. He said Russia's capacity to produce military equipment has increased tremendously. And so one more thing I want to point out here, because there's another lie that's really been floating around the West and the White House and among other just commentators on the war in Ukraine, and that is the problem is the Republicans are not passing the aid package, the $61 billion package in the House. And it's that aid package has not been passed that's preventing Ukraine from receiving more weapons. Now, there is some truth to this, right? The White House had $61 billion. There are certainly 155 millimeter artillery shells that are being delivered every month. There is a stockpile of a cluster variant of 155 millimeter artillery shells. There's other things the White House could do to deliver Ukraine air defenses. However, it really doesn't solve the major problem for Ukraine, which is they were firing 8,000 plus artillery shells a month to hold off the Russians. Now a lot of their frontline units are maybe getting one artillery shell a day. And so even if the White House steps up its arms deliveries and has the funds to deliver arms to Ukraine, it doesn't necessarily mean there's weapons available in the Western stockpiles for Kiev. And additionally, the White House has sent tens of thousands of artillery shells to Israel since October 7th. And so it's not even exactly clear that if we were producing more artillery shells, or if there was money to send more artillery shells to Ukraine, that the White House would have let to send those to Ukraine and not to Israel. All right, next up here. This one is just, comical Biden incompetence. Seized Russian yacht is costing the U.S. over $7 million per year to maintain. So a yacht belonging to a Russian billionaire was seized by the U.S. under the pretense of sanctions enforcement in 2022, costing the U.S. $7 million a year to maintain. According to Reuters, the U.S. seized the $300 million Amanda in Fiji under a warrant alleging it was owned by a Russian billionaire who was sanctioned by the U.S. in both 2014 and 2018. The U.S. wanted to auction off the yacht and give the money to Ukraine, but that is being challenged by another Russian who is not under U.S. sanctions, and he says that he's the actual owner of the ship. So the unsanctioned Russian says the yacht is actually his, and the U.S. is accusing him of acting as a straw owner to cover for the sanctioned Russian. In October of 2023, he filed court papers in San Diego, where the ship is currently docked, asserting that he owned the yacht and saying that it couldn't be sold off since he is not under U.S. sanctions. So this seems like a problem on multiple levels. One, the U.S. shouldn't just be able to seize assets, sell them off, and then send the money to Ukraine. Certainly not without any kind of court procedure or anything like that. But also that this is costing the U.S. taxpayer millions of dollars a year and probably will continue to do so well into the future. One quick story about China that I want to mention this week, because I think we'll be talking about China a lot more next week because of it. So China Hawk Representative Mike Gallagher to visit Taiwan next week. So the Financial Times reports Mike Gallagher, who is the head of the U.S. House China Committee, he is one of, if not the biggest China hawk in the House, and he is a Republican from Wisconsin. And he will visit Taipei next week with a group of lawmakers in a show of support for the newly elected president of Taiwan. The hawkish Wisconsin Republican will arrive in Taiwan on February 21st, so that is a week from today, according to 3 people familiar with this plan, including 2 Taiwanese officials who expect him to lead a delegation of 7 U.S. lawmakers. Now, fortunately, Mike Gallagher maybe doesn't have the status of Nancy Pelosi when she was Speaker of the House and visited Taiwan, so I do not expect China to have a mirrored reaction to what they did when Pelosi visited. However, I do expect China to, issue several condemnations about this and then to conduct some kind of military drills around the island of Taiwan, probably involving both aircraft and warships, probably crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait and otherwise flying through Taiwan's air defense identification zone, or, conducting naval operations in waters there, maybe not in Taiwan's actual, Taiwanese waters, but are pretty close to that. These are the kind of operations that I expect China to take in response. All right. Now let's get on to what's happening here in Gaza. Sorry, guys. It's all really bad news here. So this one, Biden not reconsidering unequivocal support for Israel's slaughter in Gaza. So Dave DeCamp writes at antiwar.com, President Biden has no plans to alter his policy of unequivocal support for Israel's slaughter in Gaza, despite claiming in private conversations that he's frustrated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, NBC News reported on Monday. Sources told NBC that Biden had disparaged Netanyahu in private conversations with other people, including some campaign donors. The source claimed that Biden said he wanted a ceasefire, but Netanyahu was, quote, giving him hell, and at least in 3 instances, Biden referred to the Israeli leader as an a-hole, although he, actually said the word there. Biden has even said he believes Netanyahu wants the war to drag on so he can remain in power. As polling in Israel shows, they want the Israeli leader to step down once the onslaught in Gaza comes to an end. Biden has also said publicly that he believes the Israeli conduct in Gaza has been over the top, but the apparent frustration has done nothing to alter U.S. policy of unconditional military support and political support for Israel. The NBC News report reads, yet even as Biden has escalated his rhetoric, he has not yet prepared to make significant policy changes. Officials said he and his aides continue to believe his approach of unequivocally supporting Israel is the right one. Israel has recently rebuffed U.S. comments and concerns about operations in Gaza since October 7th. On Sunday, Biden spoke with Netanyahu by phone and said Israel should only launch an attack in the southern Gaza city of Rafah if it has a plan to account for the safety of over 1 million Palestinians packed into the city. But on Sunday night, Israel unleashed a series of airstrikes on Rafah, killing around 100 people. Israeli bombed 2 targeted mosques and 12 residential buildings in the city. There was a ground element as well, as Israel rescued 2 Israeli hostages, or at least they have claimed to. Aid groups are warning that a full-scale Israeli assault on Rafah will be a bloodbath due to the number of civilians sheltering in tents on the city, which had a pre-war population of the population from the war, start of the war, has increased by over 1 million people. So a little bit more on that. This is, I would say, like kind of an update to that article. U.S. gives Israel green light to kill civilians in Rafah. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The U.S. has given Israel the green light to kill civilians in Rafah, despite public comments from U.S. officials calling for Israel to come up with a plan to protect civilians in the city, which is packed with an estimated 1.5 million Palestinians. U.S. officials told Politico that the Biden administration was not planning any consequences for Israel if it went ahead with a major assault on Rafah, which would inevitably kill a huge number of civilians. The report reads, no reprimands are planned in the words, meaning that Israeli forces could enter the city and harm civilians without facing American consequences. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby made clear at a press conference on Monday that the U.S. wasn't thinking about cutting off Israel from military aid if it went ahead with the assault. When asked if the U.S. has threatened to withhold military aid, Kirby said, we're going to continue to support Israel, and we're going to continue to make sure they have the tools and capabilities to do that. President Biden is also not reconsidering his full-throated support for the Israeli slaughter in Gaza, despite reports of him disparaging Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in private conversations. Congress is also on board with continuing to support the mass killing of Palestinians, as the Senate voted to pass a $95 billion foreign military aid bill that includes $14 billion for Israel. Only 20 Republicans voted in favor of the bill, but the opposition is due to a lack of border deal, as virtually all Republicans are in favor of unconditional support for Israel, even more so than the Democrats in Congress. Rafah's pre-war population was 275,000, meaning Palestinians displaced from other areas of the Strip increased the population fivefold. The majority of Palestinians in this city are sheltering in street tents, leaving them especially vulnerable to Israeli attack. Israeli airstrikes on Rafah Sunday night into Monday morning killed 27 children and 22 women. So just absolutely horrific what Israel is doing in Rafah. Oh, one more thing I want to point out. So people, made a big-ish deal about Biden saying that, Israel has to do something about the Palestinians sheltering in Rafah before they launch the attack. Now, this sounds like Biden sticking up for the Palestinians. However, I think it's just kind of playing out as Israeli propaganda. And so we've seen this happen time and time again, happen in Gaza, where the U.S. will say, the Israelis have to have a plan for the Palestinians to make them evacuate before they carry out their military operations. So the Israelis will drop leaflets over the city saying that, hey, you have to evacuate. And then just a couple days later, or right away, they'll start moving their troops into the city. And if there are civilians left, they say, well, it was the civilians' fault because they were told to leave and didn't. So they must have just been on the side of Hamas. All right. Israel proposes creating U.S.-funded tent cities to evacuate Rafah. Israel has proposed creating U.S.-funded tent cities in Gaza as a part of the evacuation plan for Rafah, as Israeli forces are preparing to invade the city, an Egyptian official told the Wall Street Journal. It's estimated that 1.5 million Palestinians are packed into Rafah, which had a pre-war population of 275,000. Under the Israeli proposal, 15 campsites of around 25,000 tents each would be created along Gaza's coast to house the millions of Palestinians sheltering in Rafah. The Egyptian officials said Egypt would be responsible for establishing the campsites and that the U.S. and its Arab partners are expected to pay for the tent cities. When asked about a proposal, an Israeli official told the Times of Israel that several options were being discussed related to the evacuation of Rafah, none of which have been approved so far. The UN says it will not be a party to the further displacement of Palestinians or the evacuation plans from Rafah because there is nowhere else for the Palestinians to go. Throughout the Israeli onslaught, Israeli forces have bombed and shot people in areas deemed safe zones. A document prepared by the Israeli intelligence ministry that was leaked back in October said the best case scenario for Israel would be to expel all 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza into Egypt, which borders Rafah. The Israeli government ministers have not been shy about their desire to ethnically cleanse Gaza, but Egypt is holding firm on its position that it will not allow a large influx of refugees into its territory. And of course, the 10 cities would just be a long-term death camp for the Palestinians that are living in Gaza. So I really hope they don't go ahead with that. And the U.S. just pulls their funds and prevents Israel from attacking Rafah in the first place. All right, next up here. Israel's Ben-Gvir says Israeli military should shoot Palestinian women and children. So the Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, said Sunday that Israeli forces should shoot Palestinian women and children in Gaza if they get too close to the Israeli border. We cannot have women and children getting too close to the border. Anyone who gets near it must get a bullet in his head, Ben-Gvir said during an argument with the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Havali, about the IDF's open fire policies, according to the Jerusalem Post. After his comments leaked to the press, Ben-Gvir doubled down. In a post on X, the Israeli minister said he does not stutter and does not intend to apologize. All those who endanger our citizens by getting near the border must be shot. This is what they do in any normal state. So, I mean, can you imagine the outrage by the the 50 members, Democrat members of the U.S. Senate who voted to send Israel $14 billion. Can you imagine if Donald Trump said something like that about the U.S. border? They'd be horrified. They would be calling him a Nazi. They would be trying to remove him from office. And when the Israelis say we will send them $14 billion to actually enforce that and kill the Palestinians. In his role as Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir oversees the Israeli police, including the border police. He and the IDF general also argued about the IDF cooperating with Israeli police to crack down on protests against humanitarian aid entering Gaza at the Karim Shalom border crossing. You cannot contact the Israeli police commissioner directly, Ben-Gvir told the IDF general during the post described as a screaming match. If you want him, you need to go through me. And so Ben-Gvir is just trying to prevent any aid from entering Gaza. Just absolutely horrific. Also, worth noting here, Ben-Gvir, as the head of a police force, as the head of the Israeli border guard, you would assume that this is something, more ammunition for South Africa to use at the International Court of Justice against the Israelis, saying that, look here, they're being pretty obvious about their plans to just kill a lot of civilians. We even have the head of their police force calling for the murder of women and children simply for walking too close to a border. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on February 13th. South Africa asked Genocide Court to order Israel halt Rafah offensive. South Africa has petitioned the International Court of Justice to take emergency action as Israel plans an offensive on the Gazan city, sheltering about 2/3 of the Palestinians living in the Strip. Tel Aviv and Washington have rebuked the court for finding that Israel was potentially committing a genocide in Gaza. So this is a statement from the South African president's office. The South African government has made an urgent request to the ICJ to consider whether the decision announced by Israel to extend its military operations in Rafah, which is the last refuge for the surviving people in Gaza, requires that the court uses power to prevent a further breach of the rights of Palestinians in Gaza. Last month, the ICJ ruled in favor of South Africa in its genocide charges against Israel. The court ruled that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza, and the killing was fueled by statements made by Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. Over the past 4 months, the Israeli onslaught has rapidly destroyed the Strip, working from north to south. Tel Aviv's forces have pushed at least 1.5 million Palestinians into the border city of Rafah. The city was home to just 250,000 pre-conflict. Many of the internally displaced Palestinians living in Rafah are sheltering in tents and lack access to food and water. Israel's massive bombing campaign in Gaza has killed at least 28,000 people, including over 12,000 children. Thousands more are missing and likely already dead under the rubble. About half of all buildings in Gaza have already been damaged or destroyed. Tel Aviv's ruthless assault and has destroyed the infrastructure that is necessary to support life. A lack of clean water has caused the disease to spread. Israel has choked aid deliveries into Gaza, creating widespread starvation. Tel Aviv is preventing U.S.-funded flour from entering the besieged enclave. The Strip's medical facilities have been decimated. The largest functioning medical facility still operating in Gaza, the Nasser Hospital, was given an evacuation order on Tuesday. The hospital is treating hundreds of patients and providing shelter to thousands of displaced Palestinians. Doctors report that even people who followed the evacuation order were shot and killed by Israeli forces. All right, so let's do a little bit more detail on that flour story. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Israeli minister blots U.S. flour shipment into Gaza. The Israeli finance minister Smotrich is blocking a U.S.-funded flour shipment into Gaza that Prime Minister Netanyahu previously vowed would be allowed into the Strip, Axios reported on Tuesday. Officials said that Netanyahu personally made the commitment to President Biden several weeks ago, and that the Israeli war and Defense Security Cabinet approved the delivery to be made through Israel's Karim Shalom crossing into Gaza, where Israelis have been protesting against humanitarian aid shipments into the Strip. Smotrich's office said that he blocked the shipment because it was going to UNRWA. Israel recently accused 12 UNRWA employees of participating in the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, but the intelligence dossier the allegations were based on provides no evidence for the claim, according to multiple media outlets that have obtained the document. Regardless of the lack of evidence, the U.S. and several other countries suspended funding for UNRWA, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are now facing famine-like conditions. Felipe Lanzare, UNRWA's general commissioner, also admitted he fired UNRWA employees accused of attacking Israel without evidence. He said an investigation is ongoing and that the employees would be compensated if the allegations were found to be false. Smotrich is claiming that the UNRWA is a central part of the Hamas war machine. His office said he was blocking the shipment in coordination with Netanyahu and claimed it would be able to go through if they found a new delivery mechanism. Any delays in aid shipments could mean the death for Palestinians in Gaza. Palestinians are beginning to starve to death, but the scale of the famine related deaths is unclear at this point and is not being properly tracked, according to the American aid group Arena. The aid group said that one of its staffers had heard from a friend in North Gaza who lost his 6-year-old son to starvation. In the tragic circumstances of starvation in Gaza, there is a compounding issue. Many who perish from starvation-related symptoms aren't accurately documented. Their deaths often get attributed to other physical causes, masking the true toll of the starvation, Arena said in a press conference. Also, a couple more details on what's happening at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. Israel orders evacuation of largest operating hospital in Gaza, then fires on fleeing civilians. The New York Times reports, as an explosion sounded nearby, Israeli forces Tuesday ordered the evacuation of one of the last functioning hospitals in the Gaza Strip, according to 2 doctors and the Gaza Health Ministry, raising fears that troops would attempt to storm the facility crowded with patients and displaced people. According to the terror of those inside the hospital, Israeli forces fired on people who tried to flee the medical compound on Tuesday, with some being injured or killed, the doctors reported. The scope of the evacuation order at the hospital was not immediately clear. 2 doctors said the staff were told by the Israeli military they had been given assurances that patients and medical staff could stay at the hospital, but one of the doctors said the military announced on Tuesday using a loudspeaker attached to a drone that everyone had to leave immediately and that an attack was imminent. There's hundreds of doctors and medical staff, hundreds of patients, and about 10,000 other people sheltering at the hospital. Okay, 2 stories here on Europe's handling of the situation in Israel. Much better than the American one. Dutch court orders government to halt deliveries of F-35 parts to Israel. A Dutch court ruled on Monday that the Netherlands must halt the export of spare parts for F-35 fighter jets to Israel since they're likely to be used to kill civilians. The Netherlands hosts a warehouse of U.S.-owned F-35 parts and exports them to countries that operate the fighter jets. And so I'm not sure if this is actually going to make any differences for Israel. I know that in some F-35 parts, there really is kind of a bottleneck and there's not enough parts to go around. And on top of that, if one distributor was taken off the market, it may make a real difficulty for Israel to obtain these parts. At the same time, there's probably a lot of parts that have multiple vendors, and the US could probably find a way to work with the Dutch to make sure that these get to Israel. But good to see the some European government is starting to take steps to prevent arms shipments to Israel. And we also had the EU's top diplomat slamming the US for continuing to arm Israel. So this is Josep Borrell, the European Union's top foreign policy official, and he took a swipe at the US on Monday for claiming it is concerned about civilian casualties in Gaza while still supplying weapons to Israel to support the slaughter of Palestinians. Borrell was referencing Biden calling Israel's military operations in Gaza over the top while not changing his policy of unconditional support for Israel. Well, if you believe too many people are being killed, maybe you should provide less arms in order to prevent so many people from being killed. If the international community believes this is a slaughter and too many people are being killed, we have to think about the provision of arms, Borrell said. Since October 7th, the U.S. has claimed it is concerned about the civilians killed in Gaza, but has shown no interest in cutting off military aid to Israel. Borrell asked, "Everybody goes to Tel Aviv begging, please protect civilians. Don't kill so many, but how many is too many?" NBC News reported Monday that President Biden is still not going to change his policy of unequivocal support for Israel's mass killing of Palestinians, despite his recent comments. And we're now over 20,000 dead women and children in Gaza. All right, next up here, Netanyahu rejects hostage deal drawn up by Mossad, Shin Bet, and IDF. So the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected an outline for a potential hostage deal with Hamas that was drawn up by Israel's spy agency Mossad, the Shin Bet security agency, and the Israeli Defense Forces. So no surprise here. This is kind of what I have thought, that Israel is just kind of feigning interest in the hostage negotiation deal in order to get Joe Biden to continue to give weapons. I don't think they're actually interested in a hostage deal or pausing the offensive whatsoever, particularly Netanyahu, who I think may not only lose his political power, but also his, actual freedom. He could be thrown in jail if he is removed as prime minister, and if we have a law and pause in this conflict, I think that's very possible. All right, few stories on the West Bank here. Israel throws Palestinian rights lawyer in jail without charges. So Al Jazeera reports on January 17th, Israeli forces arrested Palestinian human rights lawyer Delia Aliyah at a checkpoint near Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank at about 2 p.m. 1 week later, Israeli authorities issued an administrative detention order against her, meaning she will be held without trial or charged for 4 months. She has worked for years, often pro bono, defending Palestinian political detainees in both Israel or Palestinian Authority prisons. During her arrest, she was subject to assaults, threats, and insults by Israeli lawyers, according to a human rights organization. She was transferred from the Israelis' Har Non prison before being later taken to the Damon prison, where she is now being held. And so, if you're going to conduct a widespread ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank, some of the first things you might want to do are start to arrest and make sure that people who could get in the way of that, like human rights lawyers, are not going to be there to get in the way. All right, next up, this was something done by the Associated Press. Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank shrink the economy. In 4 months since Israeli forces began operations in Gaza, the economy of the West Bank has shrunk by 1/5. Israel is limiting work permits for Palestinians, and checkpoints throughout the West Bank are causing economic hardships. The World Food Program estimates the number of Palestinians facing food insecurity in the West Bank has doubled to 600,000 over the past 4 months. All right, last article here. This one from The Intercept. Base where 3 U.S. troops died was secret drone base. So Tower 22, the U.S. base in Jordan, where 3 American service members were killed last month, is not simply a logistic support base, as the Pentagon had described it. What the Pentagon hasn't mentioned is that Tower 22 is also a drone base conducting long-range reconnaissance on militants in neighboring Syria and Iraq for airstrikes. According to 2 U.S. U.S. military sources. The base also serves as a staging area for Special Operations Forces and medevac helicopter home base. And while the Pentagon says Tower 22's mission was to combat the Islamic State or ISIS since Hamas's assault on Israel in October, its focus has turned to the Intercept and everybody else calls Iran-backed militia groups, but really just the Shia militias of Iraq and Syria. All right, everybody, that will do for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Hope, if you're with someone, you have a nice Valentine's Day. If not, hopefully you do something nice for yourself. I'll be back with one more show this week. And, I should mention that I was on Jacob Winograd's show. We talked about the Putin-Tucker interview. So if you want to hear me do kind of a detailed conversation about that, check that out. As far as doing a more detailed show on it, I don't really think it's necessary. I think a lot of what got discussed in that interview, my audience is already well aware of. Now, I think there are advantages to that interview, just having, getting out there to more people, more Republicans, Putin's face, kind of Putin's demeanor, the way he looks at the world are all important because the U.S. government likes to portray him as an irrational Hitlerian actor who just wants to kill, kill, kill. And that is not how he came across in that interview. And of course, that's important because a rational actor is somebody that, the United States could deal with, could negotiate with. One of the reasons I think the U.S. wants to portray Putin as this evil, vile, Hitlerian figure is so we never have to engage in any diplomacy with Putin and the Russians. So that was debunked a little bit. I thought Tucker did a nice job. I thought he confronted Putin an appropriate amount, that he didn't just let Putin say whatever he wanted. But at the same time, he is an American journalist in Russia, and with the Americans saying that he shouldn't even be allowed back in the country anyways, I understand that, he wasn't completely adversarial the whole interview. And also, that always doesn't make a very good interview, just being aggressive and adversarial. All right, everybody. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to the show. I'll be back with more later in the week.